Welcome to the BioBalance Healthcast. About 25 years ago, I read a book called Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. And he is a classically trained psychiatrist who's written a series of books now. But the focus of his work over the years has become the concept or the idea of past life regression. And that his theory is that you go through your life with a cluster of souls that are important in your life, and you're all sort of interconnected, and over multiple lifetimes you work out whatever lessons need to be learned. And that's kind of a controversial and ooh kind of thing. And I remember going to see him 25 years ago when I read the book. He was in St. Louis and giving a talk because I was a therapist and I was concerned about, is this a charlatan deal? And it was fascinating because his argument was that you look to see, when you do therapy this way, and you use this concept in therapy, you look to see if people get better. You don't fight with them over whether it's true or not true or real or not real or what have you. And so Kathy and I have been talking about that because we're going to go and see him again at a conference in the very near future. And then an article came out in Missouri Medicine, which is a journal for physicians in Missouri, and they are dedicating several articles over the next several months on the topics of death and the death experience and what are called near-death experiences. The article talks about the fact that medical capacities have improved so that people who years ago would have died and not come back medicine is able to stop them in the dying process, and they come back, whether they're resuscitated or revived or whether they come back, who knows. But what's fascinating about that is the increasing number of people that have had near-death experience. And the article talks about something called a shared death experience. And so we want to talk about that. What is it? What do people say? What are the stories? What do they have in common? The stories are amazingly similar across cultures, across religions, from different parts of the world. If you've had a near-death experience and you come back and relate what your experience has been, the details and specifics of that relating are awesomely similar.
That's the way Brian Weiss ties into this. Near-death experiences are more accepted than what Brian talks about.
Absolutely.
Near-death experiences are patients who have gone to the edge, usually seen the light or seen themselves from above, and been disconnected, their soul from their body, and then come back.
Yeah,
Brian
where
Weiss,
medicine would say they're dead, and then all of a sudden they're not dead.
Right.
Yeah.
But what Brian Weiss is doing, he's a regression psychiatrist. He regresses people back to a previous life because they have fears in this life that don't make sense. They have phobias. They have, phobias that they can't go outside. They're afraid of snakes. They're afraid
Can't
of
go swimming.
They can't go swimming. They're afraid of getting in a boat. They're afraid of being choked. They feel choked. They wake up with dreams of being choked. What he did in short was he found this, and he almost didn't believe it.
He didn't believe
His
it. No.
first patient was Catherine, and he has a whole book on Catherine, and he was regressing her because she had multiple phobias and it was impairing her life. And he said, I'm going to regress you back to birth because we haven't found the phobia yet. He tried to get her back to birth, and they jumped to another life. And he's like, whoa! This whole time they're hypnotized. So this is one thing, life after life,
Right.
with the same soul.
Right.
And then near death doesn't really talk about life after life. It just talks about the life after life on Earth and getting there and coming back. So some of these things we've experienced ourselves. So, at least I have, and I've experienced it personally. And I had never read a book about dying and returning. And I hadn't read Brian Weiss's book either.
Well, and
So-
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is one of the standard sources in the field of near-death experiences or dying and coming back. And she became interested and did research all over the world and went to every different religious area in all the continents and accumulated hundreds of stories of people that had died and come back. and they all had similar experiences. The experience of leaving their body, having a level of awareness. Sometimes they relate that they're in the emergency room, people are operating on them, they have the sense that they're up above watching it, and they're aware of conversations and procedures that are going on in the emergency room, but also out in the hallway, with their relatives or their loved ones who are concerned, and
Listening to
things
them.
that they're saying. And they have a sense of overarching knowledge and compassion, and then they get sort of sucked into a tunnel. There's a loud wind sensation, a sense of movement, traveling towards a light. Then they come into the presence of this light, and they experience this incredible, unbelievable aura of peace and
Love.
happiness and love. And sometimes there's a vision of a being. Sometimes there's just the light. Sometimes there's a voice. Sometimes they're told, you're not finished yet, you have to go back. Sometimes they're asked if they want to go back, and they want to stay there, but they have children, or they have somebody they feel that needs them, and they decide to come back, and then they come back, they wake up. And those stories are phenomenally similar. And
mine was after surgery, and I had an anesthesia issue of some type that no one understood, and I still don't know what happened, neither do they. It was a meant to be kind of thing. So after a surgery in 2002, after my hysterectomy, they couldn't get me to breathe again. My O2 went down. They thought I had brain damage, and they intubated me again in the recovery room, but I was so swollen, they had given me so much fluid to resuscitate me that I looked like a marshmallow. They couldn't get the tube down, and they put a pediatric tube down. So I was breathed by a respirator, put in a unit, and then I didn't know any of this, of course. You don't know any of it.
Unconscious.
And I don't know exactly when this happened. I think it happened right before I woke up. But I was in the unit, and you usually sedate people until morning and let the machine do its work and let the body rest. But I was going into ARDS, which is usually where your lung function fills with fluid and you don't ever come back and you die, basically. So I was in that stage of being sick, and they sent my family home against their will. And I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I shouldn't have woken up. Nobody predicted that. And I knew where I was then, and I thought I'd had a heart attack probably. And so I couldn't get the nurses. So, and this matters because it leads up to what happened, but I couldn't get the nurses, so I started kicking my feet because I thought EKG will go off. And I felt like I was choking, and I didn't know where I was. And my hands were bound and my feet were bound.
Right.
So the nurses walked in and didn't look at me. Now, these were nurses that weren't the hospital's usual nurses. We were having a nursing strike at the time, and we had nurses that were from actually another country. So they came in, they fixed everything, and they walked out, but they never once looked at me because I was pleading with my eyes to try to get them
they were thinking you
to
were
help
dying
me.
anyway. So,
Yeah, but I had never walked into a comatose patient's room without talking to him or her. That's just not something you do when you're in medicine, because they could be listening.
Right.
So at that point, I was at the most alone I'd ever been in my whole life. I was tied down. I was miserable. It was right before Easter. I'd been memorizing Romans 8:38, and that's what I just kept saying to myself. Neither death nor life, nor angels nor principalities, nor things to come, nor things in the past can separate you from the love of God. And I kept saying that over and over, and I just basically couldn't stand it anymore. So I gave up. I said, I'm done. Get me out of here. I'm done. I can't do this, and I don't want to live as a cardiac cripple. So then I was gone. I was out, and I was free. And when I woke up, I was covered in white, and Christ was in front of me, and I couldn't see his face, of course. The light was behind him, and he was covered in the white, and the white that was on his gown covered me up. So I was lying with face down at his feet. And then I began to argue with him because he told me I had to go back.
That's the Sicilian in you.
That's my problem, personal problem. But I knew it was him. I didn't hear speech. I heard telepathy. I knew he felt, he kind of was humored that I was arguing with him because, of course, he's all-knowing, all powerful. So, but I felt like I had everyone I ever met that I loved right there. They were surrounding me. It was a great feeling. It was not a bad feeling. Death is not something to be afraid of. But he was there saying, I have something for you to do. I have planned for you. And you have to go back. Now, I never once thought about my family, which is terrible. I just would love being with all of these other people that had already gone ahead. And so I was back. Immediately, I was back on the respirator. I was awake. And there was a surgeon friend who's now deceased, who was undoing my hands and taking out the tube and extubating me, and everything had reversed. I mean, everything. Like my IV, they said my Foley was empty, the urine output had gone down to nothing. All of a sudden, it filled up twice. I mean, everything reversed completely.
Fluid got out of your lungs?
Yeah. My lungs were cured. I don't, maybe I have brain damage. Who knew? But that was the most sentinel one thing in my life, because I wasn't afraid of death anymore. The problem with that is you want to die. It takes you months.
Because you want to go to that place that's so
because you want to
peaceful
go
and
there.
loving.
You want to go back. You still remember it so closely. And so it's one of those things that was inhibiting me getting back into life. The other thing was I had no hormones. And I felt absolutely terrible. And so that was my problem, arguing with God again. I came back for this.
Right.
I mean, really. And so, but he has a sense of humor. And so finally, when I gave up and asked him, I got my answer through Gino Tutera, who treated me and trained me. And then I have a new life. And now I know what he wants me to do.
Well,
Part of
and
that was the book, too.
But that's what this article in Missouri Medicine talks about, is that the people who have this experience, this near-death experience, come back with a sense of a purpose or direction for what they need to do or what they want to do. And it's not always what they had focused themselves on before. It's not like they necessarily change a career, but their sense of what's important and what they
That
value
changes totally.
is changed because they have a level of awareness or knowledge that moves them along a path that's healing for them.
But there's many things that have happened to me that aren't explainable.
Well, yeah.
But, I mean, in a big way. Like, the doctor that came to unhook me, he's not on staff at that hospital. He had awakened in the middle of the night from a dream where his mother, who'd been dead since he was 16, woke him up and told him to come to the hospital to unhook the respirator. Now, and I wouldn't have told that story because if he were living.
Right.
But because he's no longer, he died 6 months later of a heart attack.
Right.
And he was only 48. But he leaned down and said, if you tell anybody this story, he said, I'll get you.
Yeah.
So I feel safe in telling, because he thought everyone would think he was crazy.
Sure.
But it perfectly ties in.
But I've talked to people that have had similar experiences, that someone that has predeceased them comes back and talks to them. My mother, when her husband died, she told me years later that for the first week after he died, every night when she went to bed and went to sleep, she'd wake up and he would be laying in bed next to her in the clothes that she buried him in from the casket. But that he didn't move or anything except that he looked at her and talked. And they talked about all of the problems that she needed to deal with, to deal with the farm, to sell the farm, to take care of the children, whatever it might be. And so she and I had conversations. I'm very skeptical about this kind of stuff. I've never personally experienced it, and I'm kind of like, yeah, right. But whether it was an artifact that allowed her to frame her thought process, or whether he really came back and talked to her, I'm not prepared to argue. I don't know. I know that she believed, and that in believing it, she was comforted and more at peace with his passage and more focused on what she needed to do.
How you think is why no one tells you stories like this.
Because I'm a cynic?
Yeah, because you're a cynic. And that's okay, but the rest of the world's a cynic too. And that's why in a medical journal,
right.
That's pretty gutsy for them to put all this in.
Oh, it is. And
because there's lots of stories about what doctors themselves have experienced
what they
in
call a
near-death.
shared death experience,
Right.
which I had not heard of until I read this article.
And I don't believe I've been part of that. I was in the birth
To
part.
tell our listeners what that is.
A shared death experience is where you can witness them dying.
You're in the room.
You're in the room. You can witness them leaving. They're leaving their body, or you're seeing someone to take them to bring them to the next life or to heaven, and you can.
Or you experience the light and the sense of overwhelming peace and calmness. There's a connection to the stories that people tell that they relate when they come back. That connective experience is reported by family members, physicians, nurses, the people that were present at the moment of death and recovery. I mean, they can all talk about it later. They all knew and felt and heard similar things at the same time.
I've had spiritual experiences since I was a child, weird, different, unusual, not seen by anybody else, and which would make me crazy, but I'm not. I mean, in doctors' eyes generally would mean that's why you don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Because
you're afraid of being labeled as crazy.
Yeah, you have spirituals that can't be explained by anything except being another dimension, another sight. And those are things that are gifts. But I can't tell the future. None of that. It's just weird little things that have happened.
Our culture, the American culture, is a culture that really has problems with death.
Yeah.
And the cultural evolution of how we handle death. You know, we send people to the hospital to die. Death becomes sterile. It's not a family experience. It's not a shared experience. It used to be generations ago, but it typically is not now. Although it's coming back. There are magazines and journals, and there's a movement to get people to bring their loved ones home to die and be with them and care for them as they die. We have to change some of the way insurance pays and some of the way government regulations and so on. There's an interesting article in here. A physician is writing about the death of his friend, and he said that for years, his friend, who was a heart surgeon, had conversations with him about, when it comes to be my time to die, I don't want extreme measures done. I don't want to be intubated, put on a respirator. I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this. And this friend, who was a doctor, was this doctor's patient. And so he had all that conversation documented in the patient's records. The friend had a stroke. His wife and family were not around. They took him wherever he was, took him to the hospital. The hospital immediately hooked him up to all of this
The friend,
stuff.
not the heart doctor, or the heart doctor.
The heart doctor who had said, I don't ever want this done. So when this doctor who's writing the article was called, your patient friend is in the hospital in extremis, he's got all these problems, went to the hospital, he took the documentation with him. And he had a conversation with the family. He said, look, here's what he said to me over and over again. And the family agreed, and they unhooked
Thank goodness.
the equipment, and his friend went into a coma and died the way he wanted to die. And he says in the article that one of the nurses that worked at the hospital brought charges against him for murder, for killing the doctor. And he said it was fine, it all worked out, they had the documentation, the family was supportive, nothing bad happened. But he says his point is that a lot of physicians won't follow the path he followed because they're afraid of the consequences of the law or the families or the distress that people will feel for their patients. But more and more of them are choosing to die that way. More physicians are choosing to die that way for their own death. And it's a real interesting conundrum in medicine, that these guys who know all that medicine can do and exactly how it is done, and who have because they're physicians in hospitals, have the ability to access that, the cost isn't so much a factor, are choosing not to access it.
Well, even the cost is a factor to somebody, but the cost isn't a factor to them.
Right.
Because they don't want that. They know what kind of torture people are put through.
And the cost-benefit ratio, for what? For a week more, a month more?
Well, they don't want to be on a respirator and be out of control. That's another issue. Doctors have to be in control.
I've noticed that.
Really? Okay. So they'd rather be in control of their own death, and I kind of applaud that.
Yeah.
Rather than be at the mercy of a machine, and I applaud that. But the question is, would that same doctor give their own patient that same
information
care,
and advice and encouragement?
Yeah, I guess there's lots of reasons why that wouldn't happen, but
well, there are, and I don't want to get lost in the thicket. The global conversation we're having is about the death and dying process and our understanding of it as a phase or a step in life and a part of life.
It is part of life.
And trying to get some meaning about that as opposed to the specific mechanical process of dying or being dead.
And the purpose of medicine in general is to keep people alive.
Right.
And that's where we get the disconnect
Yeah.
between keeping people alive and keeping people in a quality life. Because the mission is just to keep people alive.
Yeah.
And that mission isn't enough. And so if all of our studies and all of our research and all of our cholesterol medicines and everything else just are to make our lives longer but not better, not useful, not participatory, just to get us into a nursing home for 20 years, then that's failure to me. But that's what every doctor's taught. You are taught to keep a life going. And so it's very hard to think about this and to think this way as a physician unless you're thinking about it for yourself.
Right.
Because our goal with our patients is something different than our goal with ourselves. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
And so we can have personal
And your role
goals.
is different, and it
our
needs
role
to
is
be different. But the conversation that they're trying to have in Missouri medicine is how do we define that role and progress towards the betterment of it.
Right.
So
That's right. And so, and this is just a very time has come movement and article, and it's just one of the doctors here has written a book on near death. It's called Life After Life, and it's written by Moody, Dr. Moody. And so that would be something if you are interested in that.
right.
It's from a doctor's perspective.
But I guess too, lawyer talk at the end. Have conversations with your family and loved ones about what they want. Document that. Get the forms and the paperwork filled out so that when the time comes, the people that you've entrusted to do what you want done are legally able to do what you want done. So think about what you want done.
I mean, in
terms
the
of
state of
treatments
Missouri,
that you
you can
receive.
you can download from the Bar Association.
Yeah.
You can download your healthcare initiative. Is that what it's called?
Durable power.
Durable power of attorney. Just
For
married to an
healthcare
attorney
decisions, yeah.
for healthcare. So you can download that and fill it out yourself. You just have to have it notarized.
And somebody has to know where it is and have to
Yeah.
have copies of multiple copies of it. Because
Yeah.
when you go to the hospital, every time you have to take somebody to the hospital or every time you go back, they want you to have another copy of it, even though it's in their files.
Have your little packet by the back door. Just
Have
in
it on
case.
your smartphone.
Yeah.
Just be ready.
Yeah, it's easier now.
Yeah.
But that's something that they have to have before they put you on a respirator. Now, the way I was on a respirator wouldn't have been, if I had said I don't want to be on a respirator, they would have still put me on a respirator because I wasn't really at risk of dying at that point.
Right.
So you still go onto a respirator if you need it and they think there's a chance you'll live. But if they know
There's an option to
There's-
turn it off.
it's terminal or it's over,
Right.
then they can turn it off. So this is a very spiritual yet very practical
Yes.
kind of approach to this.
Yeah.
And we aren't really speaking about what we believe, although my story does have content in it about what I believe.
Right.
And but there's room for all kinds of different beliefs in this. It's gone through history and through all over the world that people have experienced this. There is something after life.
Well, and whatever your beliefs are, there are practical, legal, and medical reasons for obtaining information and making decisions so that other people know what you want.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.